Thank you so much, Sebastian, and thank you all for being here. It's so nice. We share a colleague in Felix Mulholzer, and of course, Zhao was here in Boston with Jack Copeland and Diane Proudfoot in 2017. So I like to claim him partly as a student, but of course, he's now independently a scholar in his own right. And you're absolutely right. It's been the last 10 years or so that touring has been the focus, and I'm going to share with you today what, relative to contemporary discussions of AI, looks quite archaic, I think. But I do think we need to eat our vegetables first before we begin discussing AI and so on. And so the scientific clarification of the notion of computability that Turing gave us was truly philosophical. And I began reading Turing's work in about 2010 because the centennial of his birth was 2012. And I'd always been convinced there must have been some impact of Wittgenstein and Turing on one another. But I was amazed when I started reading Turing's papers at how much philosophy and how much philosophy of logic is in there. And this is something that the wonderful biography of Turing by Andrew Hodges, The Enigma, leaves a little bit to the side. So I love that biography. I think it's great. I also love Ray Monk's biography of Wittgenstein, but I think Ray underestimates the kind of philosophical exchange that was important both to Wittgenstein and Turing. And I think Andrew was underestimating the power of philosophy. So as a humanities-centered director, I want to emphasize that today. And I'll give you what more or less is a précis of some of my papers. Now, I did want to say something, I don't know where people can see this, about the journal Philosophies, because there's a special issue on Alan Turing that was put together by Zhao Fan and Diana Proudfoot in 2022. And Philosophies is a wonderful journal. I don't know, can you see the title of my slides or not? I don't know. Anyway, so the special issue on Turing, this is all open access, and Philosophies really is a very rapid publisher of articles. One can put together experts in the field across a number of generations quite quickly. So I just wanted to mention that special issue on Turing. And there's a current special issue that I'm co-editing with Sandra Logier on the notion of forms of life. And Sebastian, we're very pleased to have your paper be part of that issue. So the interweaving of Wittgenstein and Turing goes on in contemporary philosophy. Now, I don't seem to be advancing. Let me see here. Okay, so what are the main claims? First, I want to argue that Wittgenstein and Turing shared a matrix of foundational ideas. Take that away. About the nature of logic. And they also discussed the nature, limits, and foundations of logic over many years. And they drew from one another, as I think they both recognized. So that's the third claim. And the fourth is that we have kind of a confluence of ideas forged over many years, not a kind of conflict, which is the picture that one gets from Ray Monk's otherwise wonderful biography and many other discussions too. Usually Wittgenstein is the romantic humanist and Turing is the mechanistic scientist. And this is regarded as some kind of clash of worlds. But I want to argue against that picture. So the direction from Wittgenstein to Turing is maybe a little bit easier than the direction from Turing to Wittgenstein. I do think Wittgenstein influenced Turing to take up an anthropological perspective on the foundations of logic, beginning in Turing's undergraduate years and in discussions stretching into Turing's time at Bletchley. Without this influence, Turing would not have discovered the Turing machine as quickly as he did. So that's why I think this is historically very important. Also, Turing's interest in what he called phraseology, using a term that one would have seen, for example, in Russell's Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy, which was the book that got Turing interested. It also got Stephen Kleene and Gödel interested in foundations of math. The term phraseology is there. It also occurs in Wittgenstein. And Turing is thinking about that. Second, I think Turing's analysis of logic was very stimulating for Wittgenstein in 1937 to 1944, because this was the period when Wittgenstein turned very concertedly to the foundations of mathematics and applied his anthropologically inspired ideas to the foundations of logic. And it wasn't until 1936, the end of 36, early 37, after he would have heard of Turing's great first result, which I'll discuss in a moment. It wasn't till then that he got to his later style of writing, the way philosophical investigations is a kind of first-person investigations. And in the preface to Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein says explicitly that he came to see that logic did not have the formal unity that he had thought in his earlier work it did. So what we could call its gappy presentation of logic, that I think echoes certain very foundational points that Turing is making about the notion of logic. And in particular, the idea of human forms of life and conversation is treated by both of them as fundamental. So in terms of phraseology, this notion, which I want to explore a bit today, Turing had a much more deeply philosophical and far-reaching understanding of foundations than is generally appreciated. He focused on taking what we say and do with words seriously, and on the limits of formal methods and mechanisms, not only on their power. So human-human interaction in the presence of machines, human logic and conversation, indirect discourse and phraseology, and not only psychology, neurophysiology, and technology were fundamental for him. We offload routines onto machines in order to interface with other human beings, and it's that interface that he is very fascinated by. And in particular, everyday language, including our evolving conceptual framework, our typings of objects, as these occur naturally in science and everyday life, I think Turing thought are and will remain crucial to the development of intelligent machinery. And he says pretty explicitly that he got some of those ideas from attending Wittgenstein's 1939 Cambridge lectures, which were on the foundations of mathematics. So the Turing machine and much of Turing's work has this anthropological cast and style, and it bears the stamp of ordinary language philosophy. And this makes it perhaps farther from current generative AI and deep learning algorithms, but it's good to see the original home of a clarification, if you can. So I'm going to make the argument by examining the Cambridge context of Turing's work with Wittgenstein, or the possibilities he would have had for learning from Wittgenstein. Then I want to look very carefully at the argumentation in his greatest paper of 1936 on computable numbers. And then I want to look at some of his subsequent writings, 1937 to 54, when he was interested in AI and wrote some of the most prescient early papers on the future of intelligent machinery. And I want to show you that the notion of phraseology remains very important to him. So I'm arguing against certain philosophical readings of Turing that at least were very prevalent during my career up until pretty recently. First, I think Turing was tended to be read as a philosopher of mind, and my beloved teacher Hilary Putnam, who's the one who invented the notion of functionalism when he was teaching at MIT, I think this got the wrong idea about Turing across. So Turing is associated with behaviorism, computationalist reductionism, functionalism, which of course Putnam eventually gave up under the pressure of certain Wittgensteinian ideas. He gave it up himself. AI and the singularity. So the idea is that Turing is associated with the idea of machines inevitably becoming the primary drivers of cultural change and creativity. And I think that's absolutely wrong. Turing was neither a behaviorist nor a reductive mental mechanist. And we can see this if we focus on the fact that philosophy of logic, not philosophy of mind, was central for his work on foundations. So the human touch and the ideals of simplicity, which is relative, of course, as a notion to a particular context, but simplicity for humans, reproducibility, and communicability. These are norms, epistemic norms and scientific practice norms that were very important to Turing. And Turing emphasized Wittgenstein's idea of the centrality of everyday language, the human end-user parochialism that it reflects. And this parochialism is ubiquitous, if we look at the whole picture of what computing machines are doing. Okay, so let's look at Turing at Cambridge. He goes up to Cambridge in 1931, the year that Gödel proved incompleteness. So that's easy to remember. And he finished in 3 years and became a Fellow of King's in 1934 to 36. So I have to argue circumstantially here, but much history is circumstantial, so I'm comfortable. And no one else has an argument for how he came up with the Turing machine. So I guess I have the only one really running right now. In 32-33, Wittgenstein happens to have been teaching a course called Philosophy for Mathematicians. And he emphasized the Hilbertian backdrop to foundational questions. What counts in mathematics is what's written down. If a mathematician exhibits a piece of reasoning, one does not inquire about a psychological process. This is something Wittgenstein learned, of course, from Frege and was always emphasizing. And so it'll be important as a turn of thought when we get to Turing. Now, in March of 33, we know that Turing got interested in logic. He read Russell's book, and there he would have encountered Wittgenstein's idea that logic is tautologous at the very end. And he seems to have gotten very interested at that point. You can see in the margins of his copy of the book, little logical symbols. He's taught himself how to formalize. So he's into it. And a friend testified that Turing was extremely excited and stayed up all night discussing foundational issues. Now, by December of that year, Turing gives a talk to the Moral Sciences Club. I'll quote again from that in the next slide. He argues that the purely logistic view of mathematics is inadequate. And that's exactly what Wittgenstein had been arguing in his lectures at the time. And in 33 to 34 and 34 to 35, Wittgenstein dictated to his 5 math students, and they were all math students, interested in philosophy of math anyway. Wittgenstein dictated the Blue and Brown book, and I would guess that Turing heard about and probably saw those dictations. What happened with the Blue book was that Wittgenstein was supposed to teach a large course on philosophy of mathematics, and about 45 students showed up to the first lecture, and they were very bright, and they started peppering him with all kinds of questions, such as, well, Mr. Wittgenstein, what's your view about the transfinite? And they wanted all sorts of specificities. And Wittgenstein hated it. He felt he wouldn't get anywhere in the lectures. So he dismissed the students, which was a very controversial thing to do. And he said, I will dictate to a small number, and then I'll pass out the dictations. So that was very helpful for Wittgenstein, actually. He had too much written at that point, and he had to make it simple. So he used his students wisely. He used them to dictate to, and they helped him formulate his ideas in a communicable way. And I can't believe that with all the hullabaloo at Cambridge around that, Turing, who was hanging out with the math and philosophy students, it seems impossible if Turing didn't look at the Blue book. Okay. So here's the report we have from Braithwaite of the paper he read, the Moral Sciences Club, again, a philosophy club. He suggested that a purely logistic view of mathematics was inadequate, that mathematical propositions possess a variety of interpretations, of which the logistic was merely one. Now, one could read that if one had a sophisticated reading of Hilbert, and I'll be discussing this in my second lecture. One could read this as a very Hilbertian kind of remark, because Hilbert was not a reductionist about logic either. But it also bears the stamp, possibly, particularly with the use of the word logistic, of a reaction against Carnap, for example, and let's say Quine, philosophers who wanted to sort of totally formalize all of science. And we'll come back to that. Now, Turing graduated in 1934, and his thesis reproved the central limit theorem. He didn't realize it had already been proved, but he did it on his own. So it was in probability. And in the summer, he visited Göttingen. I think we can't rule out that he talked about logic and foundations with people when he visited Göttingen. Hodges says he thinks he went to Göttingen to discuss probability, but that's possible. But I think actually it's also possible that he would have heard about all the foundational and philosophical questions going on in Göttingen. Okay, so we have now, we have On Computable Numbers, his greatest paper, which appears in 36. So what's the background to his invention of the Turing machine and the universal machine and his analysis of computability? Well, in Easter term of 1935, Turing took Newman's course, which covered open problems of metamathematics, and it went pretty clearly step by step through Hilbert Bernays' textbook. So it covered all the basic open problems. It discusses the Richard paradox and lays out Gödelization. And we also know from Hodges' biography that Turing was seen discussing diagonal arguments with Alistair Watson and Braithwaite during 1936. Alistair Watson was the friend of Turing's who introduced him to Wittgenstein, and they later had a discussion group in 1937 together. Now, by May of 1936, Turing had resolved the Entscheidungsproblem, Hilbert's decision problem, and so the history of science question is, how did he do this so quickly? And I'm arguing by circumstantial evidence that it was his encounter with Wittgenstein and the Cambridge tradition of thinking about philosophy of logic that really was crucial for Turing. He saw how to connect that to this open problem. So, read with this Wittgensteinian mode in mind, we can see that Turing's paper bears the stamp of Wittgenstein's way of thinking about logic anthropologically rather than metamathematically. So Turing doesn't proceed in the way an ordinary logician would have proceeded, with a formalism and a series of meta-theoretical statements about it, nor does he worry too much about where he stands when he codes up his machines. Turing analyzed in that paper what a step in a formal system is. Okay, so this is the question. What is a step in a formal system of logic? And he analyzed that by thinking through what it's for, what's done with it by human beings. So I would argue that what's great about that paper is he makes the very idea of a formal system, or a step in accordance with the simplest rules of a logical system, plain or homespun, to use Wittgenstein's favored word. And I do want to emphasize that Turing's particular way of emphasizing the of resolving that problem. Sorry, I'm just going to get rid of that. Yeah. Turing's particular way of resolving Hilbert's problem was not the application of a pre-existing blueprint of ideas and methods in the metamathematics literature. So when he first handed the paper to Newman, Newman didn't understand it at all. He didn't see how anything so simplistic could have any bearing on the problem. But instead, what Turing did was to offer a philosophically informed analytic exercise. It's an intuitively satisfying simplification of simplicity. So there's something self-reflexive going on here and circular of a very deep and important kind. Now, as an application of his analysis, Turing resolves Hilbert's decision problem in the negative. Now, what was the decision problem? Hilbert's asked for a definite method or algorithm that could determine for every statement of mathematics expressed formally in an axiomatic system using first-order logic, whether or not that statement can be validly deduced from the axioms. And what Turing shows is that there is no such definite method. So it's a negative result, but of course it's very positive to have a limitative result. So what had to be done was that Hilbert's notion of a definite method had to be analyzed. So we were asking ultimately, what is a formal system? What is a definite method? What is it to take a formal step in a formal system of this kind? What is an algorithm, or what is a logic? These are all the questions that had to be answered and clarified. And the answer, I think, here of Wittgenstein and Turing is that to say what a formal system is, we cannot just write down another formal system. We have to get at it conceptually and philosophically. And I would point out one basic logical point. The basic logical point is that if you have a negative resolution of a problem, what you have to do is to clarify all possible ways in which what you show cannot be done might have been done. Okay, so it's different if you have a positive solution. If you're arguing that there exists an algorithm to do something, then you just have to write down the algorithm. But to show that there is no algorithm, you have to clarify what it would have been to do it. I'm very sorry this is jumping around. I'm trying to hold it over on the side so you can see. Is this blocking your view of the slide, Sebastian?
Actually, whenever you said you wanted to put something away out of view, there wasn't anything for us to see. So don't worry, it's not being shared.
Oh, great. Okay, that's fabulous. Okay. Okay, so there it is. So I'm saying that in order to resolve that problem, something philosophical had to be done. And the other mathematicians who were approaching that problem were proceeding very differently. They were mathematicians. They were writing down formal systems. They were writing down systems of equations, the lambda calculus, all those things. But Turing shifts the whole thing by bringing the human element back in. So what he offers is an analysis of our idea of a step in a formal system by embedding the idea of a calculation and a logic in a shared human world. So it's an analogical simplification or comparison, as he says explicitly in the paper. And the analysis does not turn, I would argue, on a theory of mental states, a theory of mathematics. Whoops, I don't know how that happened. Hold on. Or logic. Instead, it uses the method of language games that Wittgenstein had shown him, I think, in the Blue Book. And he does not tend to give necessary and sufficient conditions for computations in general. What he does is he takes the everyday idea of a command and a calculation as basic elements of logic and works out a mathematically robust comparison between the activities of a human and that of a machine. A human following a definite rule unthinkingly, as Turing says. Well, here's Wittgenstein's Brown Book, section 41. I think it's not hard to see some relation to what might have struck Turing. You have a command table, you have a sentence or a command, and you have the result of following that command step by step. And there's even a point slightly afterwards in the Brown Book where Wittgenstein says, well, now suppose that we've trained a human to follow any such table, and he underlies any, and then he says, call this general training. Well, to me, in my fantasy life, that's where Turing got the idea of connecting the Brown Book to the Hilbert problem, because there's a problem for Wittgenstein there. What does it mean to talk about any such table and any human being? There's a problem of generality. And I would add that Wittgenstein's interest in following a rule becomes concerted and very far-reaching only after he reads Turing's paper. So I think this is where the heart of the transmission also should be seen. Now, I just want to emphasize the historical context of the paper. Church, Kleene, and Rosser had shown that the class of functions calculable in the Herbrand-Gödel-Kleene equation calculus is coextensive with the class of lambda definable functions. So that had been done in 35. And Church in 1935-6, building on Gödel, demonstrated that there's no effectively calculable function which decides whether two lambda definable expressions are equivalent. So in a sense, Church had shown the undecidability of logic in general before Turing did, but Turing's paper was published because it had such a different analysis of what was going on. So the result is the same as Church's in general terms, but not in particular terms. So in 36, Turing shows that no machine can compute, and he has special analyses of those terms, the desired general procedure as an application of his wholly novel analysis. And in the appendix, he shows that the functions that his machines can compute are just those that are lambda definable. And Turing's analysis was immediately accepted as, quote, intrinsically plausible. Here's Claney looking back in 1981 on the history. Turing's computability is intrinsically persuasive, but lambda definability is not intrinsically persuasive, and general recursiveness scarcely so either. Its author, Gödel, being in 1934, not at all persuaded that it analyzed the idea of effective calculability or calculation in logic. So there's something more satisfying about Turing's analysis. In the end, you have to draw in the notion of a human calculator. So it's very philosophical. This requires not a psychological account, but a logical one. It requires taking very seriously, as Wittgenstein and Turing did, the idea of a shareable, step-by-step, repeatable human calculating procedure that is intuitively mechanical and capable of being written down in a standard form. So I want to say that Turing took up a form of life or language game stance, not an ideological or metaphysical perspective. He was de-psychologizing the notion of logic, following Wittgenstein and following Frege. Unlike Post and Gödel, Post, whose 1936 analysis in terms of workers actually is probably closer to Turing's analysis than any other. But Emil Post and Gödel both took Turing's analysis to rest on the idea of a human state of mind. And both of them took his result to apply to limits of the individual human mind. And I don't think Turing did, as we'll see. Here in the paper is where he gets at the point quite explicitly. We avoid introducing the notion of a state of mind by considering a more physical and definite counterpart. It's always possible for the computer, that's the human, to break off from his work, go away and forget about it, and later come back and go on with it. If he does, he must leave a note of instructions written in standard form, explaining how the work is to be continued. This note is the counterpart of the state of mind. So this mimics what happens at the opening of the Blue Book, where Wittgenstein takes something out of Frege and says, if you're worried about what state of mind somebody has in applying a concept, well, just extrude it out of their mind and give them a picture, put something in the public realm, and you'll see what work your notion of a state of mind is doing. So Turing is getting at a certain notion of simplicity, and he's showing you a way to measure it conceptually. A human computer works locally, step by step, and can only take in a certain number of symbols at a glance. The computer takes in, quote, simple operations so elementary it's not easy to imagine them further divided. But this is not a psychological point, even if there are psychological facts about us, subitizing and so on. We have limits to what we can subitize. It's not a psychological point, it's a logical one and a philosophical one. Commands should be easy to take in when we do mathematics and logic. We have here a norm in mathematics of surveyability, and that's Hilbert's term. It's also a term that Wittgenstein explored at length, Übersichtlichkeit, Übersehbarkeit. I'm going to talk about that in my second lecture tomorrow as a norm. But its primary normative features are reproducibility, termination in certainty, and communicability. So the fact is a proof, or the computational aspect of a proof, has to be repeatable, reproducible, shareable in an easy manner. Now, there's something else about Turing's analysis that's very important. His analysis is independent of which formal system we're speaking of, or which states of mind are actually used. And this is why his model demands that we embed command routines in forms of life, that is, with techniques of operation. And the notion of technique comes into Wittgenstein's thought really concertedly only in 1937. Again, in his 1939 lectures, the notion of technique occurs over 117 times. So Wittgenstein is really working on that notion with Turing, and the notion of technique is very important to Turing as well in his writings. Wittgenstein has drawn in the notion of forms of life in 1936. He eliminates the notion of culture from the Investigations manuscript. In the Blue and the Brown book, to imagine a language is to imagine a culture. So it's more sort of explicitly anthropological. But by 1937, of course, the Nazis have ruined the term Kultur. So there are a bunch of reasons why it has to come out. But also, the notion of form of life is better for Wittgenstein. It's much better than culture, because culture is too sort of high up for what he actually needs. Now, Turing crafts his argument on computable numbers very carefully. An intuitionistic logician who rejects the law of the excluded middle in infinite context can still accept his analysis of the idea of a step in a formal system. His proof, in fact, demonstrates that it's not part of our notion of following a rule step by step or computing that we do or do not obey the law of the excluded middle. So his analysis of a step in a formal system is and must be, again, altogether independent of which formal system we're speaking of or which states of mind are actually used. So let's contrast this with Carnap, who was using the term logistic at the time that Turing was an undergraduate at Cambridge. The choice of logic is not at issue. It's a class of logics. The choice of linguistic framework is not at issue. The consistency of a command structure is not something that Turing talks about. The internal coherence or strength of a metastance is not at issue. So again, this is just to say in different language that formalization alone doesn't settle the analysis, but not for general reasons. It's for specific reasons having to do with the special problem context. Now, I searched high and low for references to Turing in Wittgenstein's work. And I was in Göttingen in 2009 to 10 with Felix Mulholzer, and we would meet once a week to go over Wittgenstein's manuscripts. And I started talking about Turing, and Felix, being an excellent German scholar, said, "But Juliet, the word Turing never appears." So I said, yes, it does. It appears once. So I'll get to the place where it appears once. I pointed that out to Felix, and I said, that's a proof. And Felix said, that's not a proof. And I said, it looks to me like Wittgenstein thinks it's a proof. And Felix said, when you convince a mathematician that it's a proof, I'll listen to you. So that's what I had to do in order to make my way with these odd interweavings of things. But I did go back and I found one place, pasted into a notebook in the middle. So we don't know, you see, that's magic tape over on the left. We don't know exactly when this was written down, but it could have been anywhere between 34 and 37. And you see here a version of Cantor's diagonal argument. It's interesting because it's in binary notation. It does involve changing as you go along the diagonal. And I want to look at this kind of argument very carefully because I want to talk about the actual argument that Turing gives in his paper. So it's clear that diagonal arguments were getting discussed between Wittgenstein and his students at this time. And the Cantor style of argument turned into a kind of finitistic setting, you might say, or recursive setting is there. So that's the best I could do by way of an explicit interest in diagonal arguments. Kreisel, in a 1950 paper on incompleteness, credited Wittgenstein with what he called a neat way of putting the point of undecidability. So Kreisel knew about this argument that I'm about to go through. Turing does not use the halting argument in order to show that there's no decision procedure for logic. The halting argument would be the typical one students would see in a course, where you present all of the Turing machines. You can, of course, code them up into notation, and then you could just imagine a series. Each row of this array, two-dimensional array, corresponds to a Turing machine's behavior. It's outputting digits. And then you go down the diagonal and you would define the contrary machine, and the contrary machine changes each digit along the diagonal. And then what you see is that there's a contradiction there, because that machine, if you program it to halt whenever the other machine on that line doesn't halt, you get a contradiction because it halts if and only if it doesn't halt. So you argue indirectly and you derive a contradiction. That's the typical argument that most computer scientists would think. But Turing does not use that argument. He knows about that argument, but instead he constructs an idiosyncratic, what he calls an unsatisfactory machine, one that turns up, and this is me, okay, I call it the do what you do argument. Okay, because the argument is something like, you have a game with cards and you pull up a card and it says to you, do what you do. Okay, the problem here is not a contradiction. The problem is that you can't do anything. Okay, now do what you do is fine if we're in a context in real life with our bodies there. Suppose I'm teaching you to ride a bike and I tell you, well, just keep doing what you're doing and you'll be fine. So that's okay. But in the context of the decision problem, all of that is taken away. And so what you have is a completely circular command. So that's the problem. And that's how the argument works. So it expresses a rule that cannot be followed. And the point of this, I want to argue, is purely philosophical. It's not only mathematical. The human interface, the human context of a shareable, actionable command is demonstrated to be fundamental to the nature of logic. So that Wittgensteinian idea that the emergence of tautologous commands is part and parcel of the evidence that there is logic at work in our language, that makes itself felt in the heart of uncomputable numbers. So here's Turing. The simplest and most direct proof is by showing that if this general process of determining whether a machine is circle-free, by circle-free he means, paradoxically, a machine that will just keep writing an infinite number of digits and never stop. Potentially infinite, of course. Then there's another contradictory machine, beta. This proof, so that's the halting argument in a nutshell. This proof, although perfectly sound, has the disadvantage that it might leave the reader, I'm imagining it would leave Wittgenstein, would leave the reader with a feeling that there must be something wrong. Okay, so the proof which I shall give hasn't this disadvantage, and it gives a certain insight into the significance of the idea of circle-free. It depends not on constructing beta, but on constructing beta prime, whose figure is phi n of n. So this is a positive diagonal argument. And I'm going to analogize it now to the Russell paradox. So there's kind of a paradox of a positive kind that you could get from Russell if you take negation out of the formulation of the paradox, which is essentially what Turing is doing with his argument. So think of the set of all sets that are members of themselves. And now ask yourself, is that a member of itself? Well, the answer is, if yes, then it is, and if no, then it isn't. So what you have is S is an element of S if and only if S is an element of S, which is, again, it's okay. It's not a contradiction, but you can't do anything with that. You're stuck with it. So the trouble is, you can't get to a decision point here. You can't play it as a game. A way to put this, I suppose, in Fregean or Russellian terms, is to say that falls under the concept and is an element of cannot be used as equated. If you try to equate them like this, it kind of falls apart. Okay, so that's the positive Russell, and that logically corresponds to what's distinctive about Turing's argument. Now, how did I learn this? Okay, not by reading Turing, oddly, until later. What I did first was I was in Göttingen with Felix, and I said, Felix, this thing Wittgenstein wrote down in 1947, he thinks it's a proof. And it doesn't look like it's a proof, but I was sure Wittgenstein thought it was, and it looked like a proof to me. So what happened was I had to make sense of that argument, and then I went back to uncomputable numbers, and I was amazed to see that that is Turing's argument. So it was an indirect path for me. Anyway, in 1947, the one place where Turing is discussed in Wittgenstein is this everyday language game or forms of life embedded version of Turing's proof on computable numbers. Now, why he was writing it in 1947, I cannot say. Whether he might have seen Turing was out and about at Cambridge, or whether he was just remembering from memory. I don't know. He may have had the paper out in front of him. We just don't know. But anyway, here's the remark. Turing's machines, in quotes, these machines are humans who calculate. I'm sorry, humans is italicized in the original. My slide's a little off. And one may express what he says also in the form of games. And the interesting games would be such as brought one via certain rules to nonsensical instructions, unsinnigen Anweisungen. And I'm thinking of games like the racing game. By the way, we don't know what that is. It could have been a board game, or it could have been these games at black pools, where people sort of like video games now, people would play with these things. Anyway, one has received the order, go on in the same way when this makes no sense, because one has got into a circle. For that order only makes sense in certain positions. Watson. Now, when I saw Watson, I knew the connection with Turing would be clear, because it was with Watson and Turing that he had discussed these foundational problems in 1937. Okay, so, but an order makes sense only in certain positions. That would be a very general point about agency and speech in the later Wittgenstein. And so this, I think, is very interesting, because you see him bringing Turing's argument into a more general setting. So here's how he lays the argument out. I will do his version rather than Turing's. A variant of Cantor's diagonal proof, let n equals fkn be the form of the law for the development of decimal fractions. N is the nth decimal place of the kth development, and the diagonal law is then n equals fn and n. So you're going to define along the diagonal, you're going to collapse the two variables, as typically we do in diagonal arguments. The two variables are collapsed into one. And there's no changing along the diagonal. You're simply positively picking it off as you go. Okay, but now there's a problem. To prove f prime of n cannot be one of the rules fkn. Okay, now here's how the argument goes, and it's a little bit funny. Assume it's the 100th. Okay, now you can assume that without loss of generality, right? It seems. I mean, just assume it's 100. Then the formation rule of f prime of 1 runs f1, 1, f prime 2 is 2, 2, and so on. But the rule for the formation of the 100th place will be f100, 100. That is, it tells us only that the 100th place is supposed to be equal to the 100th place. And so for n equals 100, it's not a rule. You see, it's a bit like the do what you do. You can't apply it. So there it is. But you only can make the argument work, of course, if you assume that it is one of the rules on the list. Okay, so this is a little bit funny as an argument. I would say it's not a fully extensional argument, because an extensionalist could argue, well, it's somewhere on the list and we just don't know which one it is. So that can't be ruled out. But the problem is that when you try to say that it is any one definite one, then you get the circle. So if you try to apply it, you get the circle. The rule of the game, writes Wittgenstein, runs do the same as, and in the special case, it becomes do the same as you're doing. So that's where I get the idea of the do what you do machine. Now, the argument is intentional. I would say not extensional. You can't defeat the idea that the rule could be somewhere on the list. But of course, it can be used, as Turing machines can be used, in some fully extensional contexts. For example, arguing that the class of computable functions is a class that you cannot diagonalize out of. I mean, it has generality. Again, it's free of any tie to a particular formalism or picture or diagramming method. And since it doesn't use negation, it depends upon no particular use of the law of the excluded middle. What it proves is a little bit delicate to say. I think it proves that there's a new rule or command that is not like the other rules on the list, in that it cannot be followed because it's tautologous. That would be Wittgenstein's way, I think, of putting this. And notice that the argument depends upon our ability to see that a rule cannot be followed, but not upon the invocation of a general logical law. And it depends, therefore, upon everyday ideas about rule following, calculating, and sharing commands. But of course, it does not depend upon community-wide agreement about which step is to be applied where. So the basic result here is that partial functions, that's the most general basic notion you need, not universally defined functions. The reason you can't diagonalize out of the enumeration of Turing machines is that you have Swiss cheese where these arrows are. Sometimes you'll have nonsense. The machine will not be defined. And because you have nonsense, you can't diagonalize out. So that's oddly the reason that one way of looking at the reason why the class of computable functions is so robust. Gödel was amazed by this. He loved this. Okay, for a couple of reasons. One is the scope of the incompleteness theorem. Of course, Gödel had a system P that he showed was incomplete, and in 1931 it persuaded most people that arithmetic could not be axiomatized completely because it was sort of a typical system. But surely one could have said to Gödel in 1931, and some mathematicians did say, well, that's just your system P. I mean, there could be some other thing that was complete, some unimaginable new form of a formal system. So Gödel knows that in order to settle the full generality and scope of his incompleteness result, there's a problem, and he had to analyze the notion of a formal system. And so he loves what Turing did because that's what Turing does. In all other cases, says Gödel, treated previously, such as demonstrability or definability, one has been able only to define them relative to a given language. And for each individual language, it's clear that the one thus obtained is not the one looked for. For the concept of computability, however, although it's merely a special kind of demonstrability or definability, the situation is different. By a kind of miracle, I don't think it's a miracle, by the way, I think that that's why it was designed, but for Gödel, it's a kind of miracle. By a kind of miracle, it's not necessary to distinguish orders, and the diagonal procedure does not lead outside the defined notion. And later he adds, the precise and unquestionably adequate definition of the general concept of formal system made possible by Turing's work allows the incompleteness theorems to be proved rigorously for every consistent formal system containing a certain amount of finitary number theory. And with Turing's analysis of computability, one has for the first time succeeded in giving an absolute definition of an interesting epistemological notion, that is, one not depending on the formalism chosen. So he has this idea of formalism freeness as an ideal, and Juliet Kennedy has just written a wonderful book about formalism freeness as an ideal. Gödel would go on to try to find formalism-free understandings of definability and provability in set theory. Okay, so that's my case for reading Wittgenstein into Turing, if you like, or Wittgenstein with Turing. And I want to say a few things because your series is on AI and human intelligence. So I thought I should say something in each lecture about that. So I have a few minutes left, I think. Obviously, one of the most important things in the 36 paper is the stored program computer concept. This is the idea of a machine that can work on its own commands, or as Wittgenstein wrote down immediately after the discussion group with Watson and Turing, the idea of a machine symbolizing its own actions. So Turing's universal machine, remember, each machine can be coded, and then you could have an alphabetically ordered, lexicographically ordered array of all the Turing machines, and then you could put them together into one giant machine, which does all the work of all the other machines. So the universal machine makes sense because you can't diagonalize out of the class. So it can perform the work of all or any Turing machines. Now, the universal machine makes possible the ubiquity of computational processing or modeling and offloading of algorithmic procedures to machines in our world. That is to say, the indefinite extent of application and ability to compress what's definable and computable in Turing's sense. You see, what counts as a computable function remains a computable function no matter what language you're in or how powerful you make the logic. So that means it's a very robust parameter. And in fact, as we know, it's an indefinite sort of applicable model to a whole range of human procedures and natural processes. Now, the universal machine shows, and I agree here with Martin Davis, who gave us an essay for our volume on Turing for the centennial, there are no dichotomies anymore between hardware data and software that are absolute, because the machine takes in data, it can alter its own commands in response to that, and it can even alter its own hardware. So we know this, that image of hardware data and software is somewhat context dependent. So the universal machine shows us the robustness in the idea that what's simple is fluid. We can't prove in general when we do and do not have acceptable notations, for example, that is to say, standardized descriptions of Turing machines. We can do it case by case, but there's no way to say absolutely whether a notation is or isn't adequate. And there's been a lot of discussion of that between Stuart Shapiro and Jack Copeland and others. But anyway, at some point, you have to take the use of the symbols as something that's a primary human activity. Now, notes on notations was discovered fairly recently, and this manuscript, which I haven't seen yet, I think Jack has seen it. It was sold for over £1 million and somehow was exhibited at Bletchley. But in any case, what I know about it is this. It's called Notes on Notations. And even when he was at Bletchley, Turing was clearly working at the foundations of logic. First of all, he did attend these 39 lectures of Wittgenstein's. He was already working at Bletchley at that time. But in 42-44, in an unpublished paper here, he explores the history of notations. So he's drawing comparisons between notations, and he runs through Leibniz, Boole, Schroeder, Peano, Russell. He's fascinated with notations. And then in 42-44, he writes a paper on types called The Reform of Mathematical Notation. And he says explicitly at the opening of that, the statement of the type principle below was suggested by lectures of Wittgenstein, but its shortcomings should not be laid at his door. So I'm just going to read you a few things from this, because it shows that the extent of Wittgenstein's impact on him went beyond the 39 lectures. It's long been recognized, writes Turing, that mathematics and logic are virtually the same, and that they may be expected to merge imperceptibly into one another. Actually, this merging process has not gone at all far, and mathematics has profited very little from researches in symbolic logic. Symbolic logic is a very alarming mouthful for most mathematicians, and logicians are not very much interested in making it more palatable. It seems, however, that symbolic logic has a number of small lessons for the mathematician, which may be taught without it being necessary for him to learn very much of symbolic logic. So we see here Turing, the pragmatist. He's interested in how quickly you can learn things. And as a matter of fact, Turing was very prescient in seeing how important software would be to the development of intelligent machinery. He had this remark he made, which is, the Americans like throwing large hardware at problems. I prefer throwing software at problems. So he wrote the first programming manual, actually. So he's interested in types for a reason. He's thinking this is where the power of the machines over time will come. Software is more important to some extent than hardware. In particular, he says, it seems that symbolic logic will help the mathematicians improve their notation and phraseology, there's that word, which are at present exceedingly unsystematic and constitute a definite handicap, both to the would-be learner and to the writer who is unable to express his ideas because the necessary notation for expressing them is not widely known. So again, learning and teaching and communicating. One must put forward a number of definite small suggestions and improvement, each backed up by good argument. I guess I've run an hour now. And it should be possible for each suggestion to be adopted singly. Under these circumstances, one may hope that some of the suggestions will be adopted in one quarter or another, and the use of all will spread. Now, I've run out of time, but I want to just go to my final 3 slides. I want to talk about his 1948 founding document of AI, which is his report to the National Physical Laboratory in 1948. And there he argues, I'm not going to read these slides, I can send them around later. The idea of building a robot that looks exactly like a human being is very impractical because he ran some calculations. The size of that machine would be as big as the Albert Hall. So he didn't think that made sense. And he predicted that you'd have to let it run around the countryside and so on. But what I want to talk about, because I just have a couple minutes, I hope, to go through these last slides. He sort of he doesn't really define intelligence, but he does suggest that we could think of intelligence in terms of appreciating the different kinds of search that are possible. By the way, this is a very Wittgensteinian idea, right? I mean, if you got one idea out of philosophical investigations, it would be that you should appreciate the different kinds of search that are possible. So what Turing does is he outlines 3 searches, and I'll close just by reading these 3 searches because I think it shows how prescient he was about the future of AI. The first is the intellectual search. So that's the search for algorithms. We might arrange to take all possible arrangements of choices in order, go on till the machine proved a theorem, which by its form could be verified. Further research into intelligence of machinery will probably be very greatly concerned with searches of this kind. We may call them intellectual searches. So that's the search for algorithms. Then he says it may be of interest to mention 2 other kinds of search. There's the genetical or evolutionary search, by which a combination of genes is looked for, the criterion being survival value. He had read Watson and Crick, of course he knew, and he could foresee that computational biology would become possible. The remarkable success of this search confirms to some extent the idea that intellectual activity consists mainly of various kinds of search. My last slide is here. Whoa, why aren't I getting there? The evolutionary search. Okay, here's the final slide. The thing is, he closes here with what he calls the cultural search. And I just want to say how prescient I think this is for us nowadays, why the humanities is still so foundational and important when we think about AI. The remaining form of search is what I should like to call the cultural search. The isolated man doesn't develop any intellectual power. It's necessary for him to be immersed in an environment of other men whose techniques, there's that word, he absorbs during the first 20 years of his life. He may then perhaps do a little research of his own and make very few discoveries which are passed on to other men. From this point of view, the search for new techniques must be regarded as carried out by the human community as a whole, rather than by individuals. So I think I will just stop there, but the cultural search is very interesting. The cultural search is a search among human beings on a global scale. And I think Turing is remarkably prescient for having seen the importance of that. So I think I'll just stop there. Thank you for listening. I went on a bit long. I hope that's all right.
That was not a problem at all. Thank you so much for that wonderful lecture, Juliet. That was amazing. We somehow stopped sharing on our end, but it seemed it was not too bad. You were on your last slide there, am I right?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I can share again if you want me to, but I thought I would look at you, so.
Right. So for the discussion, let's try to be able to see each other in big pictures, as it were. And if you want to go back to the slides later, we can absolutely do that. So thank you again, Julia. That was wonderful. The intertwining of not only the works of Turing and Wittgenstein, but also the history and theory of computing and computability. That was amazing. So thank you for that. And now you didn't really take very long at all, because I think we're at halftime. We've got 1 hour approximately for discussion. We will open up for discussion later on. I just want to let everyone know that both on Zoom and also on our live streams, we will take questions from the chat. And on Zoom, people can also raise their hand when the time comes using the emoji. If they can, we will ask you to open your mic, open your video to say something. Or if you don't know how to raise your hand in this way, then you can just let us know in the chat that you would like to ask a question, make a comment, all right? But we will begin our discussion with a response and some comments by Dr. Zhao Fan, and I'm very happy that he's with us today. I'll very briefly say a few words to introduce him, and then he'll speak for 5 to 10 minutes, I suppose. There'll be a bit of a dialogue between speaker and respondent before we open up for discussion amongst us all. So very briefly, Zhao Fan is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Kobe University in Japan, his fellowship being funded by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. He received his doctorate from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand in 2022 under the guidance of Jack Copeland and Diane Proudfoot. During his doctoral research, he also stayed at Boston University, that is our speaker's Juliet's University, as a visiting researcher. That was in the academic year 2017-18, and it was indeed Juliet who hosted his research visit then. Most of Zhao's research focuses on the development of modern logic and the computer in the first half of the 20th century, centering on the works of Turing, Gödel, Wittgenstein, and von Neumann. In addition, Zhao has been very interested recently also in the early history of analytic philosophy and the history and philosophy of AI. Now, the stage is yours, Zhao. Welcome.
Okay, so thank you, Sebastian, for inviting me to be the respondent for Juliet's lectures. So it is my great honor to do this. And thank you, Juliet, for the very interesting lecture. So actually, many people knew Juliet's works through her illuminating discussions on Wittgenstein's remarks on Gödel. But my first touch on Juliet's work is actually through her discussion on Turing and Wittgenstein on the diagonal argument. So this is her 2012 paper entitled Wittgenstein's Diagonal Argument, a Variation on Cantor and Turing. So in that paper, Juliet examines Turing's influence on Wittgenstein on the diagonal argument through Wittgenstein's localized remarks on Turing machines and the diagonal argument. So this is also what she talked about in today's lecture. And in her 2018 paper entitled Lebensform, Living Logic, Juliet puts Turing's 1936 paper into Wittgenstein's broader thought of development, particularly during the crucial period when Wittgenstein was writing philosophical investigations. Her 2018 paper focuses on central notions in Wittgenstein's later philosophy, such as rule following, forms of life, and language games. So Juliet's project is not just to examine Turing's influence on Wittgenstein, as she discussed today, but also Wittgenstein's influence on Turing, particularly on Wittgenstein's input on Turing's 1936 paper. This is perhaps not an easy task, since it is not clear the extent to which Turing was aware of Wittgenstein's works when he was working on his paper on computability. Nevertheless, in her 2017 paper titled Turing on Common Sense, Cambridge Resonances, Juliet provides a systematic treatment of her account of Wittgenstein's influence on Turing, and also in today's lecture. So this is, a very brief survey of Juliet's most relevant works to today's lectures, and hopefully it is helpful to understand Juliet's project in general. So we can, certainly discuss or even disagree with specific arguments in Juliet's talk, but in my view, the important contribution of Juliet's investigation of Turing and Wittgenstein is to provide a vivid example of the interplay between philosophers of mathematics and working mathematicians. So how Wittgenstein's philosophy plays a role, an important or even decisive role in Turing's works on logic and the foundations of mathematics, and also how Turing's work on logic and foundations of mathematics in turn have an impact on Wittgenstein's philosophy. So from a methodology point of view, Juliet's research is a paradigm of how a philosophical investigation of how such interplays should be. So in this respect, I enjoyed and learned a lot from Juliet's lecture. because of the time, I think I'd like to put two questions to Juliet about today's lecture. So as Sebastian suggested, so it would be better for this to be a dialogue. So I will put my first question. So my first question concerns the notion of anthropological. So arguably, this is the most important concept in today's talk and marks the uniqueness of Turing's analysis of computability compared to other pioneers of computability theory. So if I understood correctly, so you argue that it is precisely this anthropological perspective on the foundations of mathematics that makes Turing's analysis of computability robust, absolute, and formalism-free. But I would like to actually get a clear sense of this concept in Turing's paper. So it may be helpful if we compare Turing and Post, his 1936 formalism of computability. So as you also mentioned, I mean, Post proposed a very similar formalism of computability in terms of his problem solver or what he called worker. So maybe we could we say that, I mean, Post, his formalism also achieved some sort of simplicity. But unfortunately, I mean, his formalism did not receive much attention. I mean, definitely not at the level as Turing's analysis did. So what do you think, I mean, that is lacking in Post's work compared to Turing's? So maybe by comparing, I mean, Turing and Post, we can get a clear sense of, you know, the uniqueness of Turing's analysis and maybe what you mean by the anthropological perspective in Turing's work.
That is an amazing question. Thank you so much, Zhao. And it's very relevant for me because I'm supposed to be writing right now a Cambridge element on Wittgenstein's later philosophy of math. And what I take that request to entail for me personally is to give a reading of this anthropological move in Wittgenstein and give a reading of the 1939 lectures in light of that. So it's a beautiful question. And of course, bringing Post in is just wonderful. So you could do a search on the term anthropological in Wittgenstein's writings. And what you would see is that it sort of progresses, okay? There are two periods when he writes about Fraser's Golden Bough, explicitly anthropology. In both those phases, he's also responding to Spengler. Spengler, of course, has a rather wild romantic view about, you know, the rise and decline of civilizations. It's very Nietzschean, and, you know, the sunflowers open to the sun and then they close. And so it's about the rise and decline of cultures. And Spengler was widely written about by, for example, Neurath in the Vienna Circle has an essay, anti-Spengler, on the notion of progress. Of course, there are others. Robert Musil wrote a very compelling critique of Spengler, but somehow Spengler impressed himself on the culture. So Wittgenstein is kind of responding both to Spengler and to Fraser, but in two different periods. Okay. Now it's the later period that's of interest for what we've been talking about today. And that's the time when Wittgenstein sort of makes it clearer, I think, that he's not really discussing anthropology in the traditional philosopher's sense, the way, say, Kant did. Okay, so Kant thought that anthropology was sort of a fourth branch after theory and practice and aesthetics. Kind of a fourth branch of philosophy would be, what is the human being? And so there's this kind of general philosophical investigation of human nature. And so there are many people in the German tradition who follow this out, up through, let's say, Plessner. Okay, what is the human animal? The human animal laughs, the human animal does this various kind of things. Now, this is not what I would think of as a sort of ethnological form of anthropology, which is what you get for sure in the later remarks of Wittgenstein's. So if you search ethnological in the Wittgenstein corpus, you only see that coming out as of the Blue and the Brown book. So this ethnological would be much more of an insistence on, let's say, the parochial nature of our uses of concepts, the ways in which they're embedded in specific purposes in specific contexts. And so there is this evolution in Wittgenstein. And then what he does is to take the word technique. Of course, Spengler, that's a very loaded word for Spengler. Spengler is fascinated with technology as a mirror of the development of culture. And the word technique in German can mean technology as well as technique. So I think what Wittgenstein is doing is taking this turn in which no longer is anthropology sort of a branch of philosophy. We're not investigating the nature of human beings. We're investigating the nature of logic, and we're going to have a sort of ethnological miniaturization, if you like, of Spengler. So everything is parochial all the way through. So you have these examples in Remarks on the Foundations of Math, Part 1, which is a continuation of the rule-following remarks. You know, you have the people who sell wood, for example, based on the amount of ground that it covers, as opposed to how much wood we would say it is. And so Wittgenstein gets very interested in the techniques by means of which logic is actually going to be applied. So I think it's an important evolution for him. And it's why it fits with what I'm saying about Turing. But we have to be very careful that it's a new sense of an anthropological turn. It's not saying that we're investigating human nature as such. Instead, we're going to go parochial, even on elementary forms of rule following like computation or measurement or addition or particularly logic. Okay, and the one place where he mentions Watson again is a very interesting remark in Part 1 of the math book, where he invokes Hilbert. I think I'll talk about this in my next lecture. He invokes Hilbert. He invokes first Frege on the laws of thought. Then he invokes Hilbert, saying that logic gives us the technique of our thinking. That's Hilbert. And then Wittgenstein says, but actually it's various techniques. And then he says Watson. So Wittgenstein is using Turing there, I think, for his discussions with Watson and Turing to try to show the progress he made with the notion of logic and the attention to forms of life, the attention to localized occasions of uses of words. He's showing that as a form of progress. And what that does is to, you might say, make philosophy vulnerable to the anthropological turn, as opposed to the traditional idea of anthropology as a branch of philosophy. So he's, making philosophy receptive, let's say, to Turing's clarification and receptive to other fields. Now, the great part of your question also contains Post here. Post, of course, has a similar human move. Okay, so, and that's why his analysis is so compelling too. So I think it reinforces what I'm saying about Turing. Post, I think, did not, I don't know whether he read Wittgenstein. It's sort of hard to say. He wasn't close to the Blue Book or anything like that. But his idea are workers. So the idea is you have letter boxes and the worker has to mechanically sort those things into boxes. Also a kind of formalism-free response. I would say about Post, one thing that interests me is he knew Scheffer. And I've written a recent paper about Scheffer and C.I. Lewis. Scheffer was Russell's man at Harvard, which was a difficult thing to be, but that's what he did. And Scheffer, in contrast to C.I. Lewis, was always interested in set theory and the foundations of mathematics. And what he tried to do, and Russell mentions this actually in the second edition of Principia, he says Scheffer has this whole new way of writing about logic. I commend him to that. Now, people think he means the Scheffer stroke, but he doesn't mean the Scheffer stroke. He means this more ambitious program of Scheffer's, which was essentially what he called a theory of notational relativity. Scheffer also was trying to get something absolute. It was some kind of universal algebra of notations, because of course the jungle of notations was getting to be unmanageable. And Scheffer could see that. I mean, the Scheffer stroke is great from the point of view of simplifying, but you all know that if you actually write something out using the Scheffer stroke, it's impossible to read. So there's actually a practical problem about notations of a kind of pragmatic kind. And Scheffer is really on to that. And I did find some letters in the archives between Scheffer and Post, which confirm how early Post understood that incompleteness was a likely result, or undecidability, a likely result of formalization. And he writes to Scheffer, and he's seen Scheffer's work, and he says, listen, you're not going to be able to extend your analysis. It's not going to work because things are going to get too complicated. And I've just been realizing this in my own work. So there's a very interesting interplay with the pragmatic tradition, which is also an algebra of logic tradition in the United States, which Scheffer, who had various difficulties and never managed to pull this together, but it's definitely what he was after, was some kind of simplification, some kind of breaking through the hold of a particular conceptual system. So in Post's case, I would put him more oddly enough in this pragmatist tradition stemming from the students of James and Royce, who were the first ones who brought formal logic into the United States. I mean, of course, Peirce himself was very important. But again, Peirce, you could see in my final slide with Turing, it seems to me likely that Turing had read Peirce, because this idea of the human community as a whole, a mathematician does probability and picks a card, knowing that there'll be other picks of the card among other mathematicians. So this pragmatist tradition is also very important and something that interests me. But I would give that account of Post not really an explicitly anthropological account, as I would for Turing and Wittgenstein. That's a very long way around to answer the question, but it's a great question, one that I really have to think hard about. I'm not quite sure. This notion of technique is very central to thinking about later Wittgenstein's turn. And there's some odd response to Spengler going on there. But it's also incredibly important when Wittgenstein says in the investigations to master a language is to master a technique. That is part of his response to the rule following dilemmas. And it's just extra interesting that Turing also likes the notion of technique. But by technique, what Turing tends to mean is an algorithm. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think there are lots more. I mean, to be explored about Post. I mean, how he came to the formalism of like problem solver or worker, and also perhaps the reception of his work, because like, I mean, Gödel just keep appraising, I mean, Turing's work, but given the similarities between Turing and Post, but you know, Post, his work did not really, I mean, receive much discussed, or I mean, nowadays of course there are some discussions, but looking back to the histories in logic, it does not really receive much discussion as Turing's work.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think among the generation of students like Martin Davis or John Stachel, who studied with Post at City College, those people absolutely knew it. And Davis did a lot to actually unearth, you know, I mean, there were various mental problems that Post had. So he'd periodically have breakdowns. He had incredibly high teaching load. I mean, he wasn't within the elite framework of institutions in the way that Turing was. So it was the people who came through City College like Martin Davis and John Stachel who knew about Post. And Davis did a lot of really important scholarship on that. Elizabeth de Mol has started working. She's got some wonderful things on Post. So I agree with you, it is better now. But I think that his abilities were well known among that older generation. It's just that, you know, when we do the history, we tend to think about the pop rock stars like Turing and Wittgenstein. But Post, it's equivalent in terms of its sophistication as an analysis, and that needs saying. And I'm very interested in this pragmatic strain that he represents in the United States. The first 2 or 3 generations of people who brought Principia and brought analytic philosophy in that sense into the United States. It's very, very important.
Okay, so thanks. So let me ask the second question. So so this question is about your interpretation of Turing's argument. I mean, the do what you do, the argument. Well, this argument, of course, is often ignored because people just think, oh, we can do it like the Euro way. I mean, we can using like the diagonal argument as Cantor did, and so we can establish the result. However, I mean, this is I do agree with you, and also it is striking, I mean, to see Wittgenstein's remark on Turing just capture this argument very accurately, because I mean, Turing defines in the 1936 paper, defines computable numbers in terms of what he called circle-free machines, and circle-free machines are defined in terms of circular machines. So, but the term circular machine might be very confused to like contemporary, computer scientists or mathematicians, or maybe even to people at Turing's time, because Turing's way of using this like circular is like a machine that can only print finite number of the first type of symbols. And it's quite maybe kind of unusual use of this term. However, Turing explicitly said that the significance of the term circular will be explained in section 8, where he presented this diagonal argument. So so it is clear that Turing chose this term very carefully and had this particular argument in mind, which Wittgenstein captured in 1947, and you elaborated in a series of your works. So I'm just curious about if you have anything to say about Turing's his choice of this word circular, and is this the same as what Wittgenstein in 1947 says, like like the some rule that you some circular rule that you get some point is nonsensical, or has there something different? I guess.
Yeah, that's really good. I think it's really clear. I hadn't quite thought about it this way, but it is clear from the start of the paper that he has the argument in mind, and he does refer forward to section 8. So he is choosing that notion of circular very, very carefully. And the thing about a circular machine is it'll stop printing. So it's a little bit odd, whereas circle-free means that the machine will just continue going. Now, I don't know how broad we want to be. I'm giving a talk in China. But the whole idea of using humans as machines, that's a very important figure in the history of philosophy. The investigations has a certain encyclopedic quality to it. So, you can always ask yourself, like, where's Marx, in this picture in investigations? And of course, Wittgenstein is not so heavy-handed that he's going to use Marx's name, but he's going to have a little remark where he says, oh, the transition from a quantitative to a qualitative. He'll have little allusions to these things. Now, in Turing's case, if we think about sort of the productive character of machines, then you want to have the circle-free ones because they just keep going. It's like they don't get stuck. And in Watson's thinking about contradictions, when they discuss that in 39, there's always this problem about what happens if the machine gets stuck. So I don't know, but of course, this notion of circular gives voice to the fundamentality of the notion of a partial function. Okay, a partial function is one where you're going to reach a point where it's not clear what you should do. Now, implicitly, I agree with Jack Copeland. Turing does already have in mind these O machines, these non-deterministic machines in uncomputable numbers. I mean, he sort of brings that up. At the heart of what he's doing, of course, is looking at determinate machines for which the next step is determined. But okay, so the circular machines are kind of this transition over toward the O machines, you know, which is where the future of, let's say, AI would go with these probabilistic machines. But circular just really gives voice to the idea that the partial function is fundamental. It's the more general of the two notions. And that's implied by this anthropological move, because a human command only makes sense in certain positions. Okay, and that's a feature of what makes it what it is. Whereas, you know, an untrammeled, non-halting machine will just kind of go on and be circle free. Why he chose circular, I don't know, but I guess the only explanation is the one you've given, which I like very much, which is in section 8, you get the do what you do machine, or, you know, what you could call the positive diagonal argument. It simply is in virtue of defining the diagonal that you get the result. You don't have to do any work. You don't have to change anything. It just is there in the way it is presented. So I think he chose circular. That's nice for that reason. It ends with a human being or a machine that doesn't have a command. It just stops. And that is of the nature of a command, right? I mean, to follow a command, you have to be able to follow the command. I mean, you could tell the person go on forever doing this, but that isn't really a command. So you need to have something circular in his terms for the human being. But I have to think more about it. I haven't really investigated what other uses of the word circular there would be.
Yes.
One might want to think about that, because circular could mean, well, I'm presupposing the very thing that I'm defining. I mean, it could express a certain kind of ultimacy there, but it seems that it's linked to the finite nature of human commands and human following of commands in some way. So I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure. But the best explanation I know of is the one you've just given us, which is the argument that he will use, the diagonal argument he will use, will involve some kind of circular or tautological definition. And it will reveal how fundamental that notion of a partial function, a partially computable function really is. That's the general notion that you need. So that brings in nonsense and all these other sorts of human accretions to the idea. But it's good. It's a very, and it isn't what we would ordinarily mean by a circular machine, which is, you know, a spinning beach ball in the case of your Mac or something like that.
Yes. Yes, and it's well, just a follow-up comment, not a question. So, well, I mean, I think people find that term is kind of puzzling to some extent, is because so the argument he gave in section 8 points to one sense of the term circular, but another sense of a circular machine that follows from his definition is that this machine can, you know, print an infinite many digits, but only like the second can't, because he distinguished like the first can, the second can, like you know, like the machine does not really compute like one. The first can is like the odd, you know, number of square, and the second cant, which kind of marks the progress of the machine, which is kind of print on the let's say even number of square. So a circular machine could be a machine that, you know, prints forever, but only like the second cant of symbols. So I think it might. I mean, we still need to think about why, in that sense, that is circular. That is also like can be called or Turing called it a circular machine. Maybe it concerns of like our ability to see that this machine, even though it will run forever, can only print finite number of digits of the first count, maybe. So I'm not.
Yeah, maybe it has to do with this idea of operating on its own commands, going back and surveying what it already did, and then somehow in doing that, it reaches a limit to what it can do. That's perfectly possible. I mean, I think, you have to extract retrospectively this idea of the stored program computer concept from what Turing is doing. It's definitely there, but it's the idea of the machine that can operate it on its own symbols that Wittgenstein gets interested in, right? That's really one of the new ideas, and that is circularity in some kind of clear way. I mean, that's the thing about logic. You talk about the symbols by means of which you're talking about something. And that's essentially circular and essential to the nature of logic on this view. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, okay. So thank you. So that's my comments and questions.
Thank you. Characteristically brilliant questions from Zhao.
Oh yeah, I can only agree. And I would love to say just keep doing what you're doing, right? Do what you do. Go on with this wonderful dialogue between the two of you. But I think it's time that we open up to everyone in the meeting. The Zoom meeting's pretty big. I'm sure there'll be people who would like to join in. Everyone's welcome to do so. You can just let me know in any way you can that you'd like to do so, because the setting is such that we'll have to open your mic, open your video for you. You can raise your hand, there's an emoji function, or just throw any emoji out and I'll take that as a sign that you might want to come in and give a comment or ask a question. Or you can write in the chat if you like. Okay, let's just give people a moment here. Bring up some courage. I think there might be a question in the chat. Arturo.
Yes, a question from Arturo.
Right.
Arturo, hi, Arturo. Thank you for this. I have to read it though. Hold on.
Or perhaps Arturo would like to speak it out for us. You're welcome to, Arturo. You can ask him to open the mic and open the video. Otherwise, we'll just read it for you.
Arturo, do you want to give your talk? Can you open your
We're just searching for him here on the long list of participants. Perhaps he has. Oh, there he is. Okay, so we'll ask him to come and speak. There he is. Okay, wonderful.
Hi, Arturo. How are you?
Hello, Juliet. Very nice to meet you once again, and thank you for the organizers for this event. Hope you're doing all right. Okay, so thanks for the talk. I'm gonna read the comment / question. My question is about the concept of computation. So in the Philosophical Investigations 193, Wittgenstein warns us against this idea of taking the machine as its symbol, because both the machine and its symbol are determined in different ways. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on what you think the application of the concept of computation to machines is, because some people, I'm trying to argue against this view, but some people might say that insofar as the notion of computation applies primarily to human beings, it might not apply in the same sense as machines, because in the notion of machines, there is no logic or normative element involved. So I wonder if you can maybe give us a few words about this. Thank you so much for the talk once again. I'll mute myself.
Thank you, Arturo. Well, obviously 193 is a great section. The machine symbolizing its own action. Wittgenstein appreciates this stored program concept. Right? He understands that you can code up the behavior of Turing machines inside other Turing machines. And that in following out this comparison, and Turing does say it's a comparison, so this is an argument by analogy. you do have the idea that you could write a Turing machine to get something to change its behavior. Now, in those passages, Wittgenstein's interested, of course, in the logical must, right? Mathematical or logical necessity. So how is it that we could say the steps of the machine are already determined ahead of time? That seems to clash with the anthropological idea of a command, but it also instantiates a certain philosophical problem, which Elizabeth Anscombe was going to think a lot about. Namely, does a command already presuppose the conditions of obeying it, or somehow the obeying conditions embedded as possibilities within the command simply as the command? So, but here we see there's a lot of plasticity Wittgenstein will insist on in human life in the grammar. What counts as obeying the rule could be shifted in various ways. There are various ways in which the logical must has to be put into a certain kind of place. So that's what's going on in the investigations. You know, he's worried about how this anthropological view of the logical must is compatible with some conception of logical necessity, but one that is not overly fantastic, and one that doesn't get you into worries about infinite extensions and steps that are somehow already taken. I mean, from a philosophy of math or logic point of view, what's happening with the rule following is he's exploring a confusion that I tried to bring out with this positive Russell argument. The confusion of thinking that you can move between the extensional and the non-extensional point of view on what you're doing seamlessly, as if those two things should fit together perfectly. So that's the problem in 191. You keep thinking, well, I'm thinking extensionally. Okay, so well, if you're thinking extensionally, then what humans do has nothing to do with it. I mean, the point of bringing in extensions and sets is to eliminate human procedures. That was the whole point, because you wanted actually infinite objects. So you had to get rid of rules and laws and procedures. But then if you adopt, it's like the duck and the rabbit. If you adopt a different point of view, which is the non-extensional point of view, well, then you have rules and you have definition, you have procedures, and that's part of your very notion. So he's, I think, supposing that Turing helps clarify this very point. And by the way, I focused on the diagonal argument because in part 2 of the math book, where he's talking about contour, those are some of the most criticized passages in Wittgenstein's work. And in my book with Felix, Felix gives a great reading of those. We have a general defense of those arguments because Wittgenstein, I think, got interested in diagonal arguments looking at Turing's paper. And then he's really asking himself, what's the difference between Cantor's diagonal argument and Turing's diagonal argument? And you see that diagonalization is a certain kind of technique. And that technique could be deployed in a variety of different contexts, one of which is extensional, which is contours, one of which is non-extensional. And so there's nothing in the diagonal argument method per se taken as a technique. And by the way, he does call it diagonalization a technique. If it's a technique, it doesn't force you to go to contour right away. There are various things about that technique that could find a home in other contexts. So that's sort of the human side of philosophy of math. Now, the thing about anthropocentrism, I mean, I'm going to talk about the Turing test in my next lecture, so I don't want to anticipate the whole thing. But I'm going to say a similar thing about the Turing test. So put in a nutshell, I'm going to say that the Turing test is a kind of language game, okay? But it should be regarded as a kind of experiment in human-human interaction in the presence of machines. You see, it's an experiment in phraseology. It's an investigation, okay? So the thing about the Turing test, everybody's always thinking about humans versus machines, but that's not what's interesting about it. What's interesting about it is always overlooked, which is the Turing test takes place in a social environment. And what happens when the screen comes down is that the person who's been trying to figure out who's the machine and who's the human is going to go over to the other human who was behind the screen and ask them, for example, to have a cup of coffee. Well, if you called them a machine, they might not want to have a cup of coffee with you, right? I mean, so the whole thing has the quality of what are we to say now, to quote Wittgenstein, what he said about Gödel. What are we to say now? That's our theme. So I think the answer to this, machines can think, is to explore the grammar, and just keep track of what's happening to the grammar. And as we know in our lives, right, we're hearing that, ChatGPT understands language. Well, okay. I mean, are you going to let that go without flagging it or not? What is the context that we're discussing it? So I think one would have to be very careful, Arturo, about whether you can invoke just this is normative, so therefore humans can't be machines. I don't read Wittgenstein that way. I think for him and for Turing, the concepts are more permeable. And what you need to do is to be very careful about the particular language game that you're playing and move slowly. And Turing says that, thinking is an emotional concept. That is, it has to do with our response in the context of an investigation of our grammar. It's not as though he's proving that, he certainly isn't proving that machines can think. That's absolutely not what he's doing. What he's doing in that 1950 paper is going through all the people who say machines cannot think, right? And it's what I said before about logic. If you have a negative result, well, you have to have an analysis of what it would have been to do it, right? So all he's doing there is he's a logician. He sees these people who are saying the machines can't think don't have a general analysis of thinking. So obviously they can't have those arguments. That's the logic of the paper. And it's obvious to me that that's the logic of the paper. So it seems to me people have been misreading the 1950 paper from the beginning, including John Searle. What Searle needs to do is to come out of the Chinese room and start talking to the Chinese people with the symbols. And then we'd see, whether he could think in Chinese. And I bet he could if he would come out of the Chinese room. So that would be my argument there. There's not going to be some general argument, I don't think. It's normative, therefore machines can't think. But nor is there going to be, these negative arguments or positive arguments one way or the other. We have to see what we're going to say. And I don't think it's obvious what we're going to say. That's why philosophical investigations, in my view, was written in the way it was. It seems impossible when you open it up. It's like, what is going on? All these voices, it's all some kind of weird poetic thing. But actually, Wittgenstein's writing that book because he sees, he's an engineer, he's smart enough to see, once you can offload human labor to machines indefinitely, language is going to change. So he wanted to be careful. And the notion of language game is there to help us do little snapshots. And then we criticize the snapshots and see what people say about the snapshots. And so the evolution of phraseology, again, is very, very fundamental. But Wittgenstein is not saying machines can or can't think.
Thank you so much, Juliet. It was
I don't know if that's
helpful.
helping you, but I would say the thing to learn here from these two particular philosophers is you're not going to get these general arguments. You're going to have
to build them up together.
You're going to have to crawl slowly. That being said, when the McKinsey people came last week to lecture us on ChatGPT, and they, began by saying ChatGPT understands language, I did raise my hand as the only philosopher in this administrative group and say, I just would like to say that I don't think that it does understand language, except in an extremely crude parroting sense. And I'm just not going to let you put that on your slide without me saying this. And everyone laughed. And they said, yeah, we speak very coarsely. And of course they speak coarsely because they want to sell machines. So, that being said, that there are criticisms to be made, but I think not the general arguments.
Thank you so much. It was fantastic. Thanks once again.
Thanks very much for that exchange and for that wonderful question also, Arturo. I want to ask a very brief follow-up question here. The question about Turing using a method of language games, right, as we can discern it in Wittgenstein. That was one that I was going to ask you. I think we've discussed that previously So I'm happy that someone else made you speak to this particular issue. And then, of course, you know that you and I agree very much about how to read that paper by Turing, the 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. And now I just wanted to ask you, because you know the history so well, and perhaps this is going to force you to, maybe not engage in guesswork, but that's what I would have to do. I think your answer can be more informed, even if you may have to make a conjecture here. The question is, for me, it is also, as you said, quite obvious how to read Turing, but at the same time, he's been so badly misread right from the start. And I have a very hard time understanding why. So I just wondered whether you had any sense of how that happened. How could that paper have been so badly misunderstood right from the start, and I would say very much until today? How's that possible?
Question, I'm afraid, I'm here being taped, so, I'm going to sound very old and cynical, okay, but it's okay. I'm old. Okay, listen, nobody ever reads carefully. Why do you think we need history of philosophy? I feel like saying, and in particular, in mid-century, 20th century and later, Frege was worried about indirect discourse, right? Like, Sebastian believes or Turing says, okay, look, it's a huge problem. It's a huge practical problem. Okay, it's becoming more of a problem for young people in philosophy because so much is published. It's like a flood. Okay, so these poor young people, I mean, you have to read all this stuff, okay, and you can't read it carefully because there's too much of it. So, and then you have to sort of synthesize positions with capital letters. That's like a technique people use. People who have this position, it's not their fault or anything, but they're having to taxonomize all this stuff. It's what Turing was saying about the types, right? The phraseology. Well, okay, there's no substitute for actually reading the primary text. Sorry, it's either indirect or direct. Now, it doesn't mean we're all going to agree on how to read every passage. I mean, in later Wittgenstein, that's obvious, okay? Now, with Turing, I think it is just that the context of this and the hype about AI and the individualism of philosophy of mind and functionalism, and behaviorism, these are the contemporary philosophical positions of readers. And they think they're being charitable to Turing, right? I mean, when the investigations first came out, believe it or not, some people read Wittgenstein as a behaviorist. They thought that was the charitable thing to do because behaviorism was the cool position. So I think the thing to learn from this is that there's no substitute for quality product, which is, you have to trust that it's worth reading. Not everybody's writing will hold up. But, Turing's writing really does hold up. And it's just that the way his work was received, Hodges did a monumental thing in the 80s in writing that biography. A lot of that material was secreted away in archives. So he did the good thing of talking to a lot of people. He knew the mathematics involved. He got Turing out as a public figure, gay rights, all that stuff. I mean, I think we have to thank Hodges for that. But doing the history of logic, was a different sort of a thing. And it wasn't the thing that was primary in people's minds. I don't know historically whether Wittgenstein ever read the 1950 paper. I think we have no evidence. We have some evidence that he didn't. But in any case, yeah, back to Zhao's point, Wittgenstein as a reader is incredibly good at extracting some basic point of an argument. And people have not been good with the 1950 paper. But, it also expresses popular culture and hysteria. I mean, we're in a time of AI panic now, but it was a time of AI panic back then, as you know, Sebastian. Turing went on the BBC because Lord Mountbatten had talked about, electronic brains He said, we built an electronic brain, and everyone got scared because there's nuclear weapons and the US dropped them on a civilian population. And now we have an electronic brain. I mean, people were right to be scared. So I think we've been here before, and Turing wanted to go out and try to present some kind of reasonable response colorfully to the public. But that's why the paper was read in a certain kind of way. And the evidence we have about Wittgenstein is that Norman Malcolm wrote him a letter in 1951 and said, Wittgenstein, have you seen this paper by Turing? You know, what is this? Is this a joke or what? And Wittgenstein wrote back and said, well, I'm not sure. I haven't read the paper, but, you know, I don't think it's a leg pull, knowing Turing, okay? Now, Turing, for his part, used to read sections of that paper out loud to Robin Gandy and crack up laughing and giggling. So it was kind of playful, but also serious. So, you know, I don't know, Sebastian, people have their own ways of taking things seriously, but the capacity of the human mind to misread is enormous. And, you know, my former teacher, Bert Drebin, used to say, that's what the history of philosophy is. It's a series of misreadings, and it's not ever going to be any other way. But I do think it's always good to go back to really solid primary texts, because what people tell you about them can be absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. And even very careful readers, my last conversation with Hilary Putnam, my beloved teacher, you know, the last conversation was about Turing. And he said, oh, the Turing machine, you know, that's something made for aliens. It's not human. You know, and I said, Hilary, this is, this is not Turing. So.
Right. That wasn't too cynical, actually. Thank you very much, Julia. That was really insightful, characteristically. Now there's a finger, so you may have to say even more about this, which is going to be even more interesting. I think it's Elam Osalton who would have liked to come in with a finger with a follow-up, if I understand correctly. So I think you'll be asked to open your mic now. Okay, there you are. Hi there.
Hi. Hello. Thanks for organizing, and it's lovely to see you again, Juliet. So, I just basically, it's just a basic follow-up. I just want to talk about this behaviorism issue. So I teach 1950 paper in my philosophy of mind class, and the first shock people have this first appearance of the human computer. So he talks about first human computer, and then the machine intelligence will be modeled on that. So there is this idea of a human computer is a shock to all students first. And the second, I think the shock was because we start with Descartes, is to realize that, I mean, there is if we will call Turing behaviorist, then we should also call Descartes behaviorist, right? So, I mean, because basically a test being behavioristic, that is, by means of public behavior, is one thing. It's another thing that the view, that is the concept of thinking itself, should be understood behavioristic. These are a whole different method. I mean, just as because he's using the skeptic method, we wouldn't call Descartes skeptic, right? We wouldn't, I think, in the same way, shouldn't call like neither Descartes on that matter or Turing in thinking that intelligence, the basic thing is that like normal conversation will reveal intelligence. Doesn't mean that you should take a behavioristic approach to intelligence, right? So that's why I was just thinking, maybe it's the talk of the next time, but maybe next talk, maybe it's this, but maybe you can say more about the difference between behavioristic tests versus behavioristic views. Behavioristic views of philosophy of mind, one might want to extract or not extract from them. And also, it's not, I think, surprising that the same kind of behaviorism charge is laid against also Wittgenstein in certain points, and that's why she even explicitly puts it to investigations. And the second point about the human computer is obviously characterized in a particular way in 1950 paper. But of course, there is this mother, right, giving the orders, and the boy is following them. Like, what was it, getting the shoes or something, right? He has to check whether the shoes are ready every day until the shoes are ready. But of course, the human computer is obviously a very localized notion compared to what other things human beings can do, right? So from the very beginning, it seems, it was never thought that everything we can do is meant to be offloaded to computers first. Can you also talk about this, like because obviously we are not just human computers in the sense in which the human computers appear in that paper. I mean, if it's, I'm foreshadowing the other talk, you can just say, ask another time. But yeah, I would love to hear something about that. Thank you.
Thank you, and that's two great questions. Much food for thought there about the 50s paper. I have to go back and read it because I can't remember offhand the exact context of the mother and the boy with the shoes, but what you say is absolutely right. And certainly there is a paper that I have read that persuaded me. Turing certainly knew about Descartes. I mean, he knew about using language as the test of intelligence. So and I really like your way of putting it that, you know, we don't call Descartes a behaviorist because he thought that by talking you could, you know, assess intelligence. And in a similar way, there's no reason to read Turing as a behaviorist. Another point about that related to philosophy of mind is that, you know, there are these objections that he goes through, and people are very confused about the last objection. The last objection has to do with extrasensory perception. Now, that's very interesting to me. Okay, so I don't know, maybe Sebastian, you have some reading of this, but like, why would Turing have thought about taking that into account? Now, I will say that there is one place in philosophical investigations where Wittgenstein says that there is no technique for something. Only one. And he says there's no technique for detecting the authenticity of human expression. And he says there's a system, there could be rules, we could teach people with tips. But unlike calculating rules, you're not going to have that. Okay, so that gets to sort of the heart of where you're going with this question, which is very interesting. Namely, what do we mean by behavior? Do we mean an expressive field of a human face with all its complexities and so on? Turing does say intelligence is an emotional concept. So it's response dependent. Now, my thing about this ESP thing, people have various ideas. Some people think Turing actually believed in ESP. I mean, I see no reason to think that. I think what he's talking about there is, you know, suppose you meet the objection of someone that we just sense it somehow. We don't really have criteria for it. We just sort of get there. And there's absolutely no behavioristic clear criteria to tell. And, you know, I think that maybe we should take that objection more seriously than we do. Because, again, a Wittgensteinian point about skepticism, you know, people can let you down. By the way, you know, you can be fooled. An expert can be fooled. So I think in a way, Turing is very craftily thinking there could be some kind of skeptical response to skepticism of that kind. And he's not as dismissive, I forget exactly what he says, but he's not as dismissive of that as you might think that he would be. He doesn't say anything general against ESP. So my best Wittgensteinian conjecture is that that's why ESP comes up. Another side point is that there's the heads in the sand objection, which he goes past quickly. I'll talk about this next time. The head in the sand objection is it would be much too horrible if machines could think. My students think he should have taken that much more seriously. I mean, if we look at AI today, actually, I think the heads in the sand objection might not be as stupid as we think. So that's just to say, I think that the array of objections he goes through is pretty interesting. And I would argue with Jack Copeland, I think, has argued this. He's not operationalizing the notion of intelligence. That you got those readings too, where he's some kind of operationalist and we have to go forward. So let's just, I don't think that that's what he's doing there either. Again, it's much more localized, as you say, much more piecemeal, much more careful. And if you just ram home the idea of a Wittgensteinian language game, then to me, that sort of helps. But there's a warning there because, of course, how do we read Wittgenstein on language games? What I'm saying won't help if we have the wrong reading of that. So to my mind, a language game is simply a snapshot, a simplified snapshot of a portion of human language use designed for a particular occasion in order to elicit responses from readers of a variety of kinds. Okay, so on my reading, our language is not a language game. Okay, it's something more artificial. It's more like logic. Okay, you're snapshotting some argumentative structure or some grammatical structure. But Wittgenstein makes a couple of mistakes. Like a couple of times he says that our language is a language game. He's just wrong. Okay, I just think he was falling asleep and just don't listen to him there. He's wrong. So my view of language games is like that. And I don't see them as constituted by rules, for example, but by behavior in a broad sense. So we'd have to make sure we're reading Wittgenstein on language games the right way, or otherwise that won't help us with Turing. We could go down into two bad misreadings if we do that. But yeah, I think it's very good. Reading that paper with care shows all kinds of things. They're very interesting for the history of philosophy generally. One of which is that the notion of behavior and repertoire is complicated. But again, let's go back to where I ended my talk, appreciating the differences among different kinds of searching, right? What will satisfy you? The different kinds of desires, the different kinds of questions. If there were one thing to learn from reading philosophical investigations, that would be it. And Turing really puts that into action in that paper, I think. Take a look at the different kinds of search, the different kinds of commands. And of course, what you say about the mother and the child with the shoes is this fantasy of total automation with the singularity and all these things. No, I mean, Turing's the guy who shows you can't formalize, validity in a formal system. He's obviously understanding that. And many of his papers are quite explicit, including the final lines that he ever wrote, which is in a 1954 paper for a popular magazine on solving puzzles. It had to do with word problems. There's actually a connection with Post, I think, Joe, in that paper. But, he says there explicitly, more or less, what I've just said. He said there's no way to get rid of human common sense. There's not going to be a total formalization situation. So there's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, of the real significance of incompleteness and undecidability. I think for a long time, people sort of reacted against the use of these arguments because they were being used in sort of naive ways to defend the existence of free will and stuff like that. So that wasn't very persuasive. But I think when it comes to notions like intelligence and criteria for determining significance of behavior, there's a lot to be said for Turing's particular way of applying undecidability. And this idea of total formalization, I mean, it's just Silicon Valley's way of selling algorithms, as far as I can tell. I mean, it's absolutely not going to happen. And everything we see is, of course, there'll be progress along various lines. But, with driverless cars, guess what? It kills a couple of people, and guess what? You're not going to have driverless cars downtown. So the human context is very important. And I think Turing appreciates that.